Alright, so in this video, we're going to talk about understanding board texture. This is a very basic concept, but it's important to understand because the difference between wet and dry board textures are going to be night and day in regards to how we should play our hands. So wet board texture is a board texture that's either going to be suited or connected or a combination of both. And I have multiple different slides. We're actually going to look at example flops and we'll talk about why different board textures are going to dictate how we play our hands. So a wet board texture is going to make it so our value hands are going to be vulnerable to a lot of draws because, well, they're draw heavy, especially a suited and connected flop. On the flip side, a dry board is going to be the exact opposite. It's going to be non-suited, it's going to be non-connected, and value hands typically are not going to be vulnerable to draws because, well, there are typically next to no draws, and that's why we call a dry board texture typically a way ahead or way behind situation, where either you're way ahead of your opponent's range or you're way behind, and the odds of you catching up are really next to none. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at some example hands. So here's an example of a suited wet flop where it's all spades, queen, seven, and deuce of spades. So why is this considered wet? Well, because it's suited with three spades on the board. Let's say that we have a hand that's only top pair. Maybe it's queen jack, it is king queen, or it's ace queen. So we have top pair with either a jack, a king, or an ace kicker. Well, if we don't hold a spade, let's say that all of our hands are suited and it's either of hearts or diamonds or clubs, our hand is very vulnerable to a draw. Our opponent could not only have flopped a flush, but they could turn a flush with any spade card, and our hand is highly vulnerable to that type of a turn. Not to mention with this, if there is, for example, a jack or an 8 or 9 or 10 on the turn, they could catch up with a backdoor straight draw as well. So this would be considered a suited wet flop. On the flip side, there is the connected wet flop. Now this one is a rainbow flop, and a rainbow flop is a flop with three different suits. So we have the jack of clubs, the 10 of diamonds, and the 9 of hearts. So there's no flush possibility unless it's a backdoor flush. But if you think about all those Broadway combos of hands, a lot of them are going to be within our range and also our opponent's range. So we could have flopped a straight, or we could have flopped a straight draw with a pair, and so could they. So we have hands like king jack, we have hands like king queen, queen jack, 8 9, 7 8, 10 8, queen 10, king 10, all those different types of hands. Let's say that we have ace jack. All those different hands I talked about are going to be hands that have a lot of drawing hand equity versus that particular hand. If we have ace jack, we don't want to see a king, we don't want to see a queen, we don't want to see an 8, we don't want to see it pair the board either, because all those could potentially be bad for us. Not to mention, if we don't have a backdoor flush draw, let's say our hand is offsuited, or let's say that our hand is ace jack of spades, and a club hits a turn, or 10, sorry, not a 10, but a diamond or a heart, well, then there's a backdoor flush draw as well. So a connected wet flop makes our value hand very vulnerable as well. Now, additionally, this is kind of the worst situation you could be in, is a suited and connected wet flop. So queen, jack, 10 of clubs combines those two that we just talked about. So let's think about this. Let's say that we have queen ace of hearts. Now, yes, we do have the king that's going to complete our straight, but again, our opponent could have flopped two pair, they could have flopped a set, they could have flopped a flush, they could have flopped a straight, or they could have all sorts of different combination draws. Now, I'm not sure if I explained what a combination draw is, but a combination draw is either a combination of draws, so a flush draw and a straight draw and a pair draw, or it could be a combination where you already have a made hand and you can improve to a better hand. So let's say that our opponent has a hand like king 9 with the king of clubs and the 9 of hearts. Well, they flopped a straight, but they could also turn a flush. So that is a combo draw. So as you can imagine, with all those different draws, And us only having one pair is going to be highly vulnerable to a lot of draws on the turn or the river. So thinking about and let's go back, thinking about a suited wet flop, a connected wet flop, and a combination of both, on those types of boards, we are incentivized to fast play. And when I say fast play, I mean c-bet our value hands and not slow play it. Now, on the flip side, let's talk about dry board textures. So we're going to take a look at two. We're going to take a look at the high card dry board, which we're looking at now, and we're also going to take a look at the paired board dry flop as well. So when we talk about these dry boards, if you take a look at this one, King of Hearts, 8 of Diamonds, 2 of Spades, there are no draws. You cannot complete a straight or a flush on the turn. And so let me actually bring in Equilab and let's actually think about this. So on a dry board, we're either way ahead or we're way behind. So let me go ahead and put the flop in on here. So we have the King of Hearts, we have the 8 of Diamonds, and we have the 2 of Spades. Now, let's assume that we have Ace King, just Ace King offsuit. And let's assume that our opponent has weaker kings. So we'll do King Queen offsuit, King Jack offsuit, and King 10 offsuit. Now let's take a look at our equity. Let me slide this into the middle. Take a look at our equity. We are an 87% favorite on this flop. So this is why we call these situations way ahead or way behind. Now let's go ahead and let's change this to a set of 8s. And let's even give our opponent some stronger ace hands. Let's give them Ace Queen offsuit, and let's give them Ace King offsuit as well. Still, we are a huge favorite versus all of those top pair combos. We're a 98% favorite because the odds of them improving are next to none. So that's why dry board textures, where we're either way ahead or way behind, we are actually less incentivized to c-bet if we have a hand that is really most likely the best hand. We can actually slow play our hand. So an example like this with a set of 8s, we would actually typically want to check this hand to allow our opponent to try to catch up on the turn, or to get them to bet their hand on the turn with a pair of kings, pair of queens, pair of jacks, anything between a pair of 8s and up to a pair of kings. So on a wet board texture, we would be incentivized to bet to protect our hand. On a dry board texture, it's the other way around. We really we don't have a priority, we don't have a need to fast play our hand because our opponent really can't have that many hands that are going to call us in their entire range. Okay, so now let's talk about the paired board. So the paired board is very similar. So with the paired board on a King 5-5, again, there's really little chance of our opponent improving, right? There's no flush draws, there's no straight draws. It would have to go runner for them to improve. So let's say that we have pocket kings here. What are they going to call with if we have pocket kings? They really can't call with anything. There are no draws to call with. Are they a calling station? Will they call with a pair of queens, a pair of jacks, maybe a pair of queens all the way down to a pair of 6s? Maybe, maybe not. So it's really hard for them to continue. This is the type of a hand that is non-vulnerable. Same thing with King Queen or Ace King as well. It's non-vulnerable. So we are less incentivized to c-bet for value, and we want to allow our opponents to catch up. So that's why it's important to understand the difference between a dry board and a wet board. And let's go back to the first slide. Because wet boards are going to be very vulnerable because they are draw heavy boards, right? Our value hands are vulnerable to all these potential draws. But on the flip side, our hands aren't vulnerable because there are next to no draws on a dry board. Now, these were some extreme examples, but I want you to understand with these is that there is a spectrum. And let me get off of that tool over to my arrow tool. There is a spectrum of hands in terms of being wet and dry. So you can't just think of them as being polar opposites. It's a spectrum of very dry boards to very wet boards and also in between. So semi-wet, semi-dry, think of them from that perspective. So anyways, I just wanted to give you a high-level overview understanding of board texture so you can take that information into your post-flop play. So thanks again, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.